My family said I was too sick, too expensive, and too much of a burden on everyone's finances. So they started making comments about life insurance policies, discussing my value in monetary terms, and suggesting I'd be worth more to them dead than alive. But I wasn't sick. I wasn't expensive. While they thought I'd quietly accept being seen as a walking dollar sign waiting to expire, I was already planning to show them what worthless really looked like. This is how I taught the family who saw me as money what it meant to inherit absolutely nothing, and how I made sure they understood the difference between being valued for your wealth and being left with empty hands when the person they'd written off decided to rewrite the ending. I built my construction company from nothing after my husband died 20 years ago, leaving me with 3 young children and a mountain of debt. While other widows might have folded, I rolled up my sleeves and learned every aspect of the building trade. I started with small repair jobs, working 16-hour days, sleeping 4 hours a night, building a reputation one satisfied customer at a time. By the time my children were adults, I'd grown the company into the largest residential builder in our county. I employed 43 people, owned prime real estate across 3 towns, and had accumulated assets worth over $2 million. Every penny came from my own sweat and determination, from choices to work instead of rest, to invest instead of spend, to build something lasting for my family. My children Robert, Linda, and Michael all benefited from my success. I paid for their college educations in full, helped each of them buy their first homes, gave them generous gifts for weddings and birthdays. When Robert wanted to start his own business, I co-signed loans he couldn't qualify for a loan. When Linda went through her expensive divorce, I covered her legal fees. When Michael lost his job during the recession, I supported his family for 8 months. I never asked for repayment or treated these gifts as loans. They were investments in my children's futures, expressions of love from a mother who'd grown up poor and wanted her kids to have every advantage. I thought I was being generous, supportive, the kind of mother who lifts up her children rather than holding them back. But as I entered my 60s and started experiencing normal aging issues, arthritis in my hands, high blood pressure, occasional fatigue, my children's attitudes toward me began to shift in ways that made my skin crawl. They stopped seeing me as their successful, capable mother and started viewing me as a medical expense waiting to happen, an aging liability whose main value lay in what I'd leave behind when I died. The first real betrayal came when I mentioned having chest pains during a family dinner. Instead of expressing concern for my health or offering to drive me to the doctor, Robert's immediate response was, "Mom, please tell me you have good life insurance. We can't afford to pay for a funeral if something happens to you." Not, "Are you okay?" or "Should we call 911?" but worry about funeral costs and life insurance payouts. Linda jumped in with, "Actually, Mom, we should probably talk about your will soon. You're getting older and we want to make sure everything is organized properly." The conversation that followed was surreal. My 3 children sitting around my dining table discussing my assets and their inheritance while I was still experiencing chest pain, still needing medical attention, still very much alive and listening to every word. When I did go to the emergency room the next day, the chest pains turned out to be acid reflux from stress. But what stayed with me was how quickly my children had moved past concern for my well-being to concern about their financial futures. Every time I mentioned a health issue, no matter how minor, my children would exchange meaningful glances and start discussing practical matters like insurance coverage, estate planning, and the tax implications of inheritance. The most hurtful betrayal came when I was diagnosed with high blood pressure, a completely manageable condition that millions of people live with successfully. My doctor prescribed medication and recommended some lifestyle changes, assuring me that with proper treatment, high blood pressure posed no immediate threat to my health or longevity. But when I shared this news with my family, expecting support and encouragement, their reaction was devastating. How much will those medications cost? Linda wanted to know. Will insurance cover everything, or will you have to dip into your savings? Robert asked whether high blood pressure might affect my ability to maintain my business and whether I'd considered succession planning. Most shocking of all was Michael's response. Well, at least now we know there's a timeline. High blood pressure can lead to heart attacks and strokes. We should probably accelerate our discussions about your assets and make sure everything is properly distributed before your condition worsens. A timeline. My youngest son had just told me that my manageable medical condition gave them a timeline for my death, and he seemed almost relieved to have some framework for planning my demise and their inheritance. The conversations became more frequent and more explicit, with my children steering discussions toward estate planning, long-term care costs, and the financial burden that elderly parents can become. We just want to make sure you're protected, Mom, Linda would say with fake concern. And we want to make sure there's something left for the grandchildren's education funds. But what I heard was, we want to make sure you don't spend our inheritance on staying alive. The breaking point came during a family meeting that Robert organized under the pretense of helping Mom plan for the future. He'd asked everyone to gather at Linda's house on a Sunday afternoon, claiming we needed to have important conversations about my health, my business, and my long-term care needs. I arrived expecting a supportive family discussion about how we could work together to ensure my continued independence and well-being. Instead, I walked into what felt like a corporate takeover meeting, with my 3 children armed with legal documents, financial projections, and a plan to essentially manage me out of my own life. Mom, we've been doing research, Linda began, pulling out a folder thick with printouts and legal forms. We've consulted with an elder law attorney, a financial planner, and a medical expert about the best ways to protect your assets while ensuring you get proper care as you age. The protection plan they'd developed was breathtaking in its audacity. They wanted me to sign over power of attorney for financial decisions, claiming it would help avoid probate complications later. They wanted me to transfer ownership of my business to them immediately, arguing that it would reduce estate taxes when I died. They wanted me to sell my house and move into an assisted living facility, insisting it was more practical and cost-effective than aging in place. Most shockingly, they'd already researched specific facilities and gotten cost estimates. This place is really nice, Mom, Michael said, showing me a brochure for a senior living complex. It's only about $4,000 a month, which is much less than maintaining your house. Plus, your medical needs will be covered, so we won't have to worry about unexpected expenses eating into your savings. $4,000 a month. They wanted to warehouse me in an institution at nearly $50,000 a year, ostensibly to protect my assets, but really to ensure that my money would be preserved for their inheritance rather than spent on my comfort and independence. But the conversation that broke my heart completely came when I asked why they were so focused on preserving money rather than preserving my independence and quality of life. Michael's response was devastating. Mom, let's be honest here. At your age, with your health issues, your main value to the family is financial. We want to make sure that value is protected and properly distributed. Your main value to the family is financial. My youngest son had just told me that the primary worth I had to my children was monetary, that my life had been reduced to its cash value, that they saw me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. That night, sitting in the house I'd built with my own hands, looking at papers that would essentially sign away my independence and autonomy, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. If my children saw me primarily as money, if my main value to them was what I'd leave behind when I died, then I would show them exactly what it meant to inherit nothing from someone whose love they'd reduced to dollar signs. The morning after the family meeting, I began the systematic process of reorganizing my entire financial life with the same methodical approach I'd used to build my construction business from nothing. This wasn't going to be an emotional reaction or a temporary punishment. It was going to be a complete restructuring of my legacy to reflect how my children had chosen to value our relationship. First, I needed to understand exactly what my children expected to inherit and how they'd position themselves to benefit from my death. The life insurance policies they'd been so interested in totaled $800,000, with my 3 children as equal beneficiaries. My business was worth approximately $1.2 million, and they'd assumed they would inherit it jointly. My real estate holdings were valued at another $700,000. All told, my children were expecting to inherit over $2.5 million when I died, split 3 ways, giving each of them roughly $800,000 plus ongoing income from business and rental properties. No wonder they were eager to protect these assets from being wasted on my comfort and medical care. But their plan had revealed something crucial about their character. They valued this inheritance more than they valued me. They were willing to institutionalize me, control my choices, and manage my decline like a business transaction to ensure that their financial windfall remained intact. They'd reduced their relationship with their mother to a cost-benefit analysis. I started by changing all my life insurance beneficiaries. Instead of my children, the policies would now benefit various charities: a scholarship fund for single mothers attending trade schools, a foundation that provided housing for homeless families, and an organization that helped women start their own businesses. My children had been so concerned about my life insurance payouts. Now they could watch those payouts go to people who would actually appreciate them. Next, I began the process of selling my business, but not in the way my children had envisioned. Instead of keeping it in the family, I decided to sell it to my longtime foreman, giving him incredibly favorable terms that ensured he could afford it while ensuring I got only a modest return. I transferred ownership of my rental properties to a housing trust that would provide affordable homes for working families. My house, the one my children had been so eager for me to sell, I decided to donate to a nonprofit that helped women escaping domestic violence. They would convert it into a transitional housing facility, giving it a purpose that would honor the values I'd tried to instill in my children but that they'd apparently forgotten. I also began making significant gifts to charities while I was still alive, reducing my overall estate in ways that were perfectly legal but completely contrary to my children's expectations. Every month, I donated substantial amounts to causes I cared about, watching my liquid assets decrease while knowing that this money was going to people who would use it to improve their lives. The beauty of my plan was that it was entirely legal, completely within my rights, and absolutely irreversible once implemented. My children had spent so much time calculating their inheritance that they'd never considered the possibility that I might choose to dispose of my wealth in ways that didn't benefit them. Within 6 months, I'd transformed from a mother whose primary role was providing financial security for her children into an independent woman whose life had purpose and meaning separate from their expectations and demands. My plan went into full effect during the summer when my children began implementing their own strategy to accelerate my transition into managed care. They'd spent months researching facilities, consulting with attorneys, and building what they thought was an airtight case for taking control of my finances and living situation. What they didn't know was that I was monitoring their activities through mutual business contacts. Robert had been asking my business partners about succession planning. Linda had been touring facilities and asking about costs. Michael had been meeting with lawyers about the legal procedures for taking control of an elderly parent's affairs. Instead of waiting for their ambush, I decided to call my own family meeting. I invited all 3 of my children and their spouses to lunch at an upscale restaurant, telling them I had important announcements to make about my estate planning and future care needs. They arrived expecting to hear that I'd accepted their plan and was ready to sign their documents. I've spent considerable time thinking about our last conversation, I began after we'd ordered our meals. You've made it clear that your primary concern about my aging is how it will affect your inheritance. You've calculated the costs of my care against the value of my assets, and you've developed a plan to maximize what you'll inherit while minimizing what gets wasted on keeping me comfortable. The first revelation was about the life insurance policies. Robert, you mentioned that you hoped I had good life insurance coverage. I'm pleased to tell you that I do, $800,000 in total. However, I've recently changed the beneficiaries to reflect my current priorities and values. I watched their faces as I explained that the insurance money would now fund scholarships for single mothers, transitional housing for homeless families, and microloans for women starting businesses. I realized that this money could do much more good helping people who truly need it than providing windfalls for people who are already financially stable. Linda was the first to react. Mom, you can't be serious. That money was supposed to be for our families, for the grandchildren's futures. I smiled calmly. The grandchildren have separate education funds that I've been maintaining for years. This is about the money you were counting on to benefit yourselves. The second revelation concerned my business. I know you've all been researching succession planning and business valuations, I said, looking directly at Robert. I'm happy to report that those concerns are no longer relevant. I've sold the company to my foreman, Tommy Rodriguez. He's been with me for 15 years, understands the business inside and out, and will treat our employees fairly. Robert's face went white. You sold it? For how much? What are the tax implications? Shouldn't we have been involved in that decision? I explained that the sale price and terms were confidential, but that Tommy had gotten very favorable financing. The third revelation was about my real estate holdings. I explained that I'd transferred ownership of my rental properties to a housing trust that would maintain them as affordable housing for working families. Instead of providing rental income for my heirs, these properties will provide stable housing for families who need it. The final revelation was about my house. I'm donating this house to an organization that helps women escaping domestic violence. They'll convert it into transitional housing where women can rebuild their lives safely. The silence that followed was deafening. My 3 children sat staring at me, trying to process the fact that the inheritance they'd been counting on had been systematically redistributed to strangers. This can't be legal, Michael finally said. You can't just give away our inheritance. I reached into my purse and pulled out a letter from my doctor and a psychological evaluation I'd recently completed. I anticipated that concern, I said, handing him the documents. These evaluations confirm that I'm mentally competent, making informed decisions and acting within my legal rights. Every transaction I've made has been reviewed by attorneys and structured to withstand any legal challenges. Over the following weeks, my children made various attempts to change my mind, to negotiate some compromise, to understand how they could restore their access to what they'd considered their future financial security. But every conversation revealed how fundamentally they'd misunderstood our relationship and how completely they'd taken my love and generosity for granted. The complete devastation of my children's financial expectations began to unfold over the following months as they realized that my asset redistribution wasn't a temporary punishment or a negotiating tactic, but a permanent restructuring of their futures that they were powerless to change. The first major shock came when Robert's business hit serious financial trouble and he couldn't get the bailout he'd been counting on. For years, he'd operated with the assumption that he could take risks knowing that his inheritance from me would provide a safety net. His business plan had actually included projections based on the influx of capital he expected to receive when I died. When his company started losing major contracts and facing cash flow problems, Robert came to me with a desperate plea for a loan. Mom, I just need $200,000 to get through this rough patch, he said during a tense conversation in my living room. I know you've made some changes to your estate planning, but surely you can help your own son save his business. I listened patiently to his presentation about how the loan would be secured by future business revenues and how he'd pay me back with interest. When he finished, I said simply, "Robert, I've already given you all the financial help I'm going to provide in this lifetime. When you were starting your business, I co-signed loans worth over $100,000. When you needed help with your house down payment, I gave you $50,000. But this is different," he insisted. "This is about saving everything I've built. I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything?" I looked at him carefully before responding. "Being my son means you were raised with values of hard work, integrity, and independence. It doesn't mean you get unlimited access to my money whenever your own choices create problems." Linda's reckoning came when her husband left her, taking half their assets and leaving her with substantial legal bills and reduced household income. She'd been counting on her inheritance to provide financial security in case her marriage failed, and now she faced the reality of rebuilding her life at 52 with no backup plan. "Mom, I'm going to lose the house," she told me during a tearful phone call. "I can't afford the mortgage payments on my salary alone, and my lawyer says the divorce settlement won't leave me with enough to stay where I am. I know you're helping other people with housing. Can't you help your own daughter?" The irony wasn't lost on me. Linda was asking for help from the same mother she'd wanted to warehouse in an assisted living facility to preserve her inheritance. "Linda," I said gently, "I understand this is a difficult time, but you're a capable woman with a good job and valuable skills. You'll figure out a solution that works for your situation." Michael's crisis was different but equally revealing. His son had been accepted to an expensive private university, and Michael had been counting on his inheritance to help pay for tuition costs that his current income couldn't cover. He'd actually promised his son that grandma's money would ensure he could attend any college he wanted without worrying about student loans. "Mom, you're destroying my kid's future," Michael said during our most heated conversation. "Tyler has worked so hard to get into this school, and now you're telling me that the money I was counting on to help him doesn't exist anymore? How am I supposed to explain that to my 17-year-old son?" The conversation revealed how Michael had been using my future inheritance as a financial planning tool, making commitments and promises based on money that had never actually belonged to him. "Michael," I said, "Tyler does have an education fund, one that I've been contributing to for years and that will cover a significant portion of his college costs. But the additional money you were counting on was never guaranteed to be available for that purpose." The most devastating revelation came when my 3 children discovered that they couldn't even contest my asset redistributions effectively. They hired an attorney to explore their options, convinced that they could prove I'd been mentally incompetent or unduly influenced when I made my charitable gifts. But the legal evaluations I'd obtained, the careful documentation of my decision-making process, and the professional management of all transactions made their case impossible to prove. Their attorney explained that parents have no legal obligation to leave assets to their children, that charitable giving is strongly protected by law, and that my documented competency made it impossible to challenge my decisions on medical grounds. "Your mother was thorough in protecting her choices," the lawyer told them. "These transactions are legally bulletproof." Robert's business eventually failed, partly because he'd made expansion decisions based on expected inheritance that never materialized. He had to declare bankruptcy and take a job working for a former competitor, learning humility in ways that his entitled assumptions about future wealth had never taught him. Linda did lose her house but found a smaller place that she could afford on her own income. The experience taught her self-reliance that she might never have developed if she'd been able to fall back on inherited wealth to solve her problems. Michael had to explain to his son that college choices would be limited by what the family could actually afford rather than what they'd hoped to inherit. Tyler ended up attending a state university on partial scholarship, working part-time to cover expenses, and learning the value of money in ways his father never had. The most profound justice was that my children finally learned what it meant to be valued for something other than money. Without the prospect of inheritance creating financial incentives for maintaining our relationship, they had to decide whether they actually wanted to know me as a person, whether they could love me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The people who received my charitable gifts sent me letters describing how the money had changed their lives. Single mothers wrote about completing their education and starting careers. Families described moving from homeless shelters into stable housing. Women shared stories about starting businesses that provided for their children's futures. These letters meant more to me than any gratitude my children had ever expressed, because they came from people who understood the value of what they'd received and who used it to build better lives rather than simply expecting it as their due. My children had seen me as worth more dead than alive because they'd calculated my value in terms of what they'd inherit when I was gone. In the end, they learned that someone who views relationships in purely financial terms will eventually find themselves with exactly what they deserve. Nothing at all. 4 years have passed since I redistributed my wealth to people who would use it meaningfully rather than simply inheriting it as an entitlement. I'm now living in a modest apartment, comfortable but not wealthy, with enough resources to maintain my independence while knowing that my life's work will benefit people who truly need help rather than enriching those who saw me primarily as a source of future income. The relationships with my children have evolved in ways I never could have predicted. Robert, after his business failure and bankruptcy, underwent what can only be described as a personality transformation. The humbling experience of losing everything he'd built on assumptions about inherited wealth forced him to examine his values and priorities in ways that prosperity never had. He's now working as a project manager for a construction company, earning a modest salary and learning to live within his means. More importantly, he's begun visiting me regularly, not because he hopes to change my mind about his inheritance, but because he genuinely seems to want a relationship with his mother. Our conversations have become deeper and more authentic than they'd been in years. "Mom," he said during a recent visit, "I realize I lost sight of what really mattered. I got so focused on the business, on building wealth, on securing the future, that I forgot to appreciate what I already had." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I'm ashamed of how I talked about you, how I saw you. You were never just a source of money. You were the person who taught me everything I knew about work and determination." Linda's journey has been more complicated. The divorce and loss of her house was devastating initially, but it also freed her from a marriage that had been making her miserable for years. She's now living in a small apartment and has discovered a passion for teaching that she'd abandoned when she married young. She's enrolled in a program to get her teaching certification and talks about her future with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard from her in decades. "I forgot that I used to love learning," she told me recently. "When I thought my security was guaranteed through marriage and inheritance, I stopped growing as a person." Our relationship remains somewhat strained. Linda still occasionally makes comments about the money I gave away and how it could have helped her during her difficult transition. But she's also begun to understand that her mother's worth wasn't measured in dollars, and that the strength she's discovered in rebuilding her life came from values I tried to teach her years earlier. Michael's response has been the most resistant to change. He continues to express anger about my charitable giving, particularly because it affected his son's college choices. He sees my actions as punishment rather than natural consequences, and he struggles to understand why I prioritize strangers over family. "You gave away millions of dollars to people who don't even know you," he said during our last conversation. Tyler had to turn down his dream school because we couldn't afford it, while some stranger got money that should have belonged to your grandson. His continued focus on what he lost rather than what he could learn suggests that he may never fully understand the lesson I was trying to teach. But Tyler, his son, has shown maturity beyond his years in dealing with the changed circumstances. He's thriving at State University, working part-time, and has told me that the experience has taught him not to count on anything he hasn't earned himself. "Grandma," he said during a phone call, "I understand why you did what you did. My dad was treating you like a bank account instead of a person." The charitable organizations that received my gifts continue to send updates about how the money is being used. The scholarship fund has helped 37 single mothers complete trade school programs and start careers in construction, plumbing, and electrical work. The Housing Foundation has provided transitional homes for 43 families escaping homelessness. The Business Incubator has helped 22 women start successful small businesses. These accomplishments mean more to me than any gratitude my children ever expressed for their gifts, because they represent genuine transformation in people's lives rather than simple wealth transfer from one generation to the next. I've also discovered communities of other seniors who've faced similar challenges with adult children who viewed them primarily as sources of inheritance. We share stories, offer support, and celebrate the freedom that comes from living authentically rather than trying to meet others' financial expectations. My health has remained stable, which means my children's timeline for my death was both inappropriate and inaccurate. The high blood pressure that prompted their inheritance discussions is well controlled with medication, and I maintain an active lifestyle that includes volunteering, traveling, and pursuing interests I'd postponed during my wealth-building years. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my children had approached my aging with genuine care and respect rather than financial calculation. Would I have been as generous with charitable giving if they'd shown that they valued me as a person rather than an asset? Would our relationships have remained close if they'd supported my independence rather than planning my managed decline? These questions are unanswerable now, but they remind me that the choices we make in relationships have consequences that extend far beyond what we anticipate at the time. My children chose to see me as a financial resource, and they're now living with the results of that choice. The woman who built a construction empire from nothing, who raised 3 children as a single mother, who accumulated wealth through decades of hard work and sacrifice, deserved better than to be valued primarily for her net worth. When my family reduced me to a dollar amount, they lost the right to benefit from the dollars I'd accumulated. I kept one memento from my construction business, a hard hat I wore during the early years when I was learning the trade and building my reputation one job at a time. It sits on my kitchen table now, reminding me of the determination and independence that built everything I achieved. My children thought I was worth more dead than alive because they calculated my value in terms of their inheritance. In the end, they learned that someone who views relationships as financial transactions will eventually find themselves bankrupt in the ways that matter most. They wanted my money more than they wanted me, so I made sure they got exactly what they deserved. Nothing but the memory of what they'd lost when they chose greed over love. They thought they could reduce me to my net worth and plan my death like a business transaction. They had no idea they were dealing with a woman who'd built everything she owned through her own strength and determination, someone who wouldn't hesitate to dismantle her empire rather than let it benefit people who'd forgotten that love can't be inherited, only earned through respect and genuine care. When they finally understood that their inheritance was gone forever, redistributed to people who would use it to build better lives rather than simply add to existing wealth, they learned the difference between being valued as a person and being priced as an asset. And in that painful realization, they discovered what it truly means to inherit nothing, not just financially but emotionally and morally as well.